The family ATM. I used to think being needed meant being loved. For most of my life, I couldn't tell the difference. When people called me responsible, dependable, or mature, I felt proud. I wore those words like medals. I thought they meant I mattered. It took me 32 years to realize they were just nicer ways of saying, "Aaron will handle it." And that was exactly who I became. The one who handled everything. The one nobody worried about. The one nobody thanked. The one who was always expected to sacrifice a little more. I was sitting in my car outside my office on a rainy Tuesday evening when my phone started buzzing. Mom. I stared at the screen for a moment. 3 missed calls already. Then a text appeared. "Mom, call me immediately. It's important." I sighed. Everything was important. Every emergency. Every crisis. Every bill. Every mistake. Somehow they always ended up in my lap. I called her back. She answered before the first ring finished. "Aaron." "Hi, Mom." "Oh, thank God. I've been trying to reach you." I leaned my head against the seat. "What happened now?" There was a brief pause. Then she lowered her voice dramatically. "It's your sister." Of course it was. It was always Emily. My younger sister had spent most of her adult life treating responsibility like an allergy. At 28 years old, she'd had 7 jobs in 6 years. Every time she quit, it was because her boss was unfair. Or her coworkers were toxic. Or the company didn't appreciate her. According to Emily, nothing was ever her fault. What did Emily do? I asked. Mom hesitated. She had a small problem with her rent. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I already knew what was coming. How much? Only $1,200. Only. The word nearly made me choke. $1,200. To my family, money became tiny whenever it was mine. Mom continued quickly. Her landlord is threatening eviction. And she needs help. There it was. The part they never said directly. The part everyone understood. Aaron pays. Aaron fixes it. Aaron always pays. I rubbed my eyes. Mom, this is the 3rd time this year. I know, sweetheart. Maybe she needs to learn how to budget. Mom's tone changed instantly. The disappointment entered her voice like clockwork. Aaron, she's your sister. There it was. The family guilt card. The strongest weapon they had. No matter what happened, family came first. At least when they needed something. I closed my eyes. How much has she already borrowed from me? Silence. Mom knew. I knew. We both knew. Neither of us wanted to say the number out loud. Eventually she whispered. Probably around 10,000. Probably. As if it wasn't enough to buy a decent used car. As if it wasn't more money than some people earned in months. I looked out the windshield at the pouring rain. I'll transfer it. Mom immediately sounded relieved. Oh, Aaron, thank you. You're such a good son. The call ended 3 minutes later. I sat there staring at the dashboard. Not because of the money. The money wasn't the problem. I made good money. As a senior financial analyst for a logistics company, I earned enough to live comfortably. The problem was the expectation. Nobody asked whether I could help. They assumed I would. There was a difference. A huge difference. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my younger brother, Ryan. I laughed out loud. The timing was almost impressive. I answered. Let me guess. You need money. Ryan chuckled nervously. Actually. How much? 500. I started laughing harder. Ryan sounded offended. What's so funny? You people have some kind of group chat I don't know about. What? Nothing. He sighed dramatically. My car insurance payment is overdue. Of course it was. Ryan was 26 years old. He worked part-time. Lived paycheck to paycheck. Spent money like the future was somebody else's problem. Then called me when reality arrived. Aaron? I looked toward the dark sky. 500. Yeah. Fine. Seriously? Yeah. You're the best brother ever. The call ended. I transferred the money. Then I drove home. By the time I reached my apartment, $1,700 had disappeared from my account. Not because I wanted to spend it. Because my family expected it. The crazy thing? That wasn't unusual. That was normal. My apartment was on the 12th floor of a quiet building downtown. Nothing fancy. Just clean. Comfortable. Peaceful. Exactly how I liked it. The moment I walked inside, silence greeted me. No demands. No emergencies. No guilt trips. Just silence. Sometimes I thought that apartment was the only place in the world where I could breathe. I heated leftover pasta and sat at the kitchen table. Across from me sat a framed photograph. It had been taken 6 years earlier. Mom. Dad. Emily. Ryan. And me. Everyone smiling. Everyone looking happy. If someone saw that picture, they'd think we were close. A loving family. The truth was more complicated. I stared at Dad's face. Frank Miller. The king of impossible standards. Growing up, nothing I did was ever enough. Straight A's. Why not perfect scores? Football team. Why not team captain? College scholarship. Why not a better school? Every achievement simply became the starting point for the next expectation. I spent my childhood chasing approval that never came. And somehow I carried that habit into adulthood. Even now. Even after all these years. I still wanted him to be proud of me. The worst part? I wasn't even sure why. The next Saturday was family dinner. A monthly tradition I secretly hated. But skipping wasn't an option. Skipping meant questions. Questions meant guilt. Guilt meant endless phone calls. So I went. As usual. Mom's house looked exactly the same. The same white fence. The same flower garden. The same front porch where I used to sit as a kid. For a moment, I felt nostalgic. Nobody looked up. Ryan was watching television. Emily was scrolling through her phone. Dad was reading the newspaper. Mom was cooking. I stood there awkwardly. Waiting. Finally Mom noticed. Aaron. She smiled and hugged me. Everyone else gave casual greetings. Like I'd just come back from the grocery store. Not like I was family. Not like I'd paid nearly $2,000 of their bills that week. Just Aaron. Reliable. Predictable. Expected. Dinner started 20 minutes later. The conversation revolved around everyone's problems. Emily hated her landlord. Ryan hated his job. Mom hated rising grocery prices. Dad hated politicians. Nobody asked how I was. Nobody asked about my promotion. Nobody asked about the new project I'd spent months working on. I might as well have been invisible. Then Ryan looked at me. "Hey, Aaron." "Yeah. Can I borrow your truck next weekend?" I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because of course. Of course he needed something. Sure. Thanks. No hesitation. Just expectation. Like borrowing my truck was as natural as breathing. As dinner continued, a strange feeling settled in my chest. A feeling I couldn't quite explain. For years, I'd convinced myself these moments didn't bother me. That helping family was normal. That sacrifice was love. That being needed meant being valued. But sitting there, listening to everyone take and take and take, something felt different. For the first time, I found myself wondering a dangerous question. A question I'd spent years avoiding. If I stopped helping. If I stopped paying. If I stopped fixing everyone's problems. Would they even care about me? Or would they only miss what I provided? I didn't know it yet. But that question was about to change everything. And in just a few weeks, I would finally get my answer. My parents abandoned me at 11 to raise their perfect son. 18 years later, they came back begging for help. The farm, the old man, and the new life they never expected me to build. The morning I left home didn't feel real. Most kids imagine leaving home as something exciting. Going to college. Starting a career. Beginning a new chapter. But I was only 11 years old. And I wasn't leaving because I wanted to. I was leaving because my parents had decided they no longer wanted me around. The car ride to Grandpa's farm lasted nearly 4 hours. 4 hours of silence. My father focused on the road. My mother stared out the window. Neither of them tried to start a conversation. Neither asked how I felt. Neither reassured me that everything would be okay. It was as if they were delivering a package. Not their son. I sat in the back seat clutching a small backpack that contained the few things I cared about. Some clothes. A couple of books. And a framed photograph of me and Grandpa from years earlier. It was the only picture I owned where someone genuinely looked happy to be standing beside me. About 3 hours into the drive, my mother finally spoke. "You should listen to your grandfather." I looked up. That was it. That was the advice she chose to give me. Not, "We'll miss you." Not, "We love you." Just instructions. I nodded without responding. By then, I had already started building walls around my heart. Walls that would only grow stronger with time. When we finally reached the farm, the first thing I noticed was how peaceful everything looked. Wide open fields stretched toward the horizon. Large oak trees stood like silent guardians around the property. A red barn sat near the center of the land. The farmhouse itself was old but beautiful. Weathered by decades of storms yet still standing strong. In many ways, it reminded me of Grandpa. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw him standing on the porch. He was 72 years old at the time. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Gray-haired. And somehow stronger than most men half his age. The moment he saw me step out of the car, a smile appeared on his face. A real smile. Not forced. Not polite. Genuine. And something inside me immediately felt safer. "Dad," my father said as he approached him. Grandpa nodded. Then his eyes shifted to me. Without saying a word, he opened his arms. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I ran toward him. He wrapped me in the tightest hug I'd ever received. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I nearly started crying. Because it had been years since anyone had hugged me like they actually meant it. "Good to see you, kiddo," he said quietly. I nodded. Unable to speak. After unloading my boxes, my parents prepared to leave. The goodbye lasted less than 2 minutes. Mom gave me a quick hug. Dad patted my shoulder. Then they got back into their car. I watched them drive away. Neither looked back. Not once. The dust from their tires slowly disappeared into the distance. And just like that, they were gone. Grandpa stood beside me. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You hungry?" I laughed despite myself. "Yeah." "Good." He smiled. "Let's get lunch." That was Grandpa's gift. He always knew when words weren't necessary. Over the next few weeks, I slowly adjusted to farm life. Every morning began before sunrise. At first, I hated it. The alarm would ring at 5 o'clock. The air would be cold. The work would be exhausting. And I'd constantly wonder why everyone else got normal lives while I spent my days feeding chickens and repairing fences. But Grandpa never complained. Not once. He worked harder than anyone. And because of that, I stopped complaining too. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult day, I finally asked the question I'd been carrying inside for weeks. We were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. "Grandpa?" "Yeah." "Why didn't they want me?" The words escaped before I could stop them. For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he sighed. "You really want the truth?" I nodded. Grandpa stared toward the fields. "The problem isn't you." I looked down. "Then why did they send me away?" His expression darkened. "Sometimes people make terrible choices because they're selfish." I waited. They got so focused on one child that they forgot they had another. The simplicity of his answer hurt. Because deep down, I knew he was right. They love Noah more. Grandpa looked directly at me. "No." I frowned. "No. They love Noah differently." He paused. "But they're failing you." That sentence stayed with me forever. Because for the first time, an adult acknowledged what was happening. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't selfish. I was being abandoned. And someone finally admitted it. That night, I cried harder than I ever had before. Not because Grandpa confirmed my fears. But because he was the first person who cared enough to tell me the truth. Months passed. Then a year. My parents rarely called. Birthdays came and went. Sometimes they remembered. Sometimes they didn't. Christmas became especially painful. Every year I'd secretly hoped they'd invite me home. Every year the invitation never arrived. Eventually, hope became harder to maintain. So I stopped hoping. Instead, I focused on the life in front of me. The farm taught me things school never could. I learned responsibility. I learned discipline. I learned how to solve problems. Most importantly, I learned that your value isn't determined by who chooses to love you. One evening, while fixing a broken fence, Grandpa handed me a hammer. "Ethan. Yeah. Never spend your life chasing people." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He drove a nail into the wood. "If someone wants to be in your life, they'll make an effort." Another nail. "If they don't, that's their choice." Another nail. "But don't waste years trying to earn love that should have been given freely." At 11 years old, I didn't fully understand. At 30, those words would become the foundation of my life. As the seasons changed, something unexpected happened. The loneliness began to fade. Not completely. But enough. For the first time, I felt useful. Needed. Wanted. Not because of what I could provide. Not because of obligation. But simply because I existed. And that feeling was worth more than anything my parents had ever given me. Little did I know, however, that while I was building a new life on Grandpa's farm, my parents were busy building a future that would eventually come crashing down around them. And when that happened, they would come looking for the son they left behind. Forgotten by my own family. The first year on Grandpa's farm was the hardest. The second year was different. Not easier. Just different. Because by then, I had stopped expecting my parents to come back for me. At 12 years old, I still checked the mailbox every afternoon. At 13, I only checked it on weekends. By 14, I stopped checking altogether. Hope has a strange way of dying. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It fades little by little until one day you realize it's gone. That was exactly what happened to me. Life on the farm settled into a routine. School during the day. Farm work in the evenings. Homework after dinner. Weekends were spent helping Grandpa with repairs, livestock, and whatever else needed to be done. The work was hard, but there was something comforting about it. Unlike people, work made sense. If you put in effort, you got results. If you planted seeds, crops grew. If you repaired a fence, it stayed standing. Life wasn't always fair. But at least it was honest. People were much harder to understand. Especially parents. One afternoon during my freshman year of high school, I came home carrying a report card. Straight A's. Every single subject. I had worked incredibly hard for those grades. Not because anyone was pushing me. Not because I wanted attention. But because Grandpa had taught me something important. Success is something nobody can take away from you. I remembered those words every time I felt like giving up. That evening, I placed the report card on the kitchen table. Grandpa adjusted his glasses and looked it over carefully. His eyes widened. Then a huge smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be damned." I laughed. "What?" He pointed at the grades. "These are incredible." A warmth spread through my chest. It was such a simple thing. A compliment. A little pride. Yet it meant everything. Grandpa stood up and wrapped an arm around my shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Ethan." 4 words. Just 4 words. And somehow they carried more love than I had received from my parents in years. That night we celebrated with burgers from a diner 20 miles away. To most people it would have seemed ordinary. To me it felt like winning the lottery. Because someone cared. Someone noticed. Someone was proud. Unfortunately, moments like that also reminded me of what I was missing. The older I got, the more obvious my parents' absence became. Most of my friends complained about their mothers asking too many questions. Or their fathers being too strict. I secretly envied them. At least their parents were present. At least someone cared enough to ask questions. Meanwhile, weeks often passed without a single phone call. Sometimes entire months. The few conversations we did have felt awkward and forced. Almost like talking to distant relatives instead of family. One evening, shortly after my 15th birthday, the phone rang. I immediately recognized my mother's voice. "Hi, Ethan." "Hi." A brief silence followed. Then she asked, "How's school?" "Good." "That's nice." Another silence. The conversation felt unnatural. Like two strangers trying to make small talk. Then I heard Noah's voice in the background. "Mom. Come see this." Immediately, her attention shifted. "Oh, hold on." I waited. And waited. And waited. Nearly 2 minutes passed. Finally, she returned. "Sorry about that." "It's okay." More silence. Then she said something that hurt more than she probably realized. "Well, I should go." That was it. 5 minutes. Maybe less. The first call in nearly 3 months. And she couldn't wait to end it. After hanging up, I sat staring at the phone. Not angry. Just tired. The following year brought another painful lesson. Family reunions. Every summer, relatives gathered for a large picnic at a nearby park. It was one of the few opportunities to see everyone. Including my parents. That year, however, something happened that changed how I viewed them forever. I arrived with Grandpa around noon. The park was already crowded. Children ran across open fields. Adults talked beneath picnic shelters. Music played softly in the background. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then I saw my parents. And Noah. They were standing with a group of relatives near the food tables. I smiled. Despite everything, part of me was happy to see them. I started walking toward them. Just a casual dismissal. As though I were an afterthought. A footnote. Someone unimportant. Then the conversation immediately returned to Noah. His achievements. His hobbies. I stood there listening. The same way I had felt my entire childhood. Something inside me cracked that day. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Quietly. Permanently. Because for the first time, I realized something. My parents weren't temporarily distracted. They weren't overwhelmed. They weren't struggling. They had made a choice. And that choice wasn't me. A few months later, I received confirmation of what I had long suspected. The discovery happened completely by accident. One Saturday afternoon, Grandpa and I visited my aunt's house for dinner. After the meal, everyone sat around looking through old family photo albums. At first, it was fun. Baby pictures. Holiday gatherings. Birthday parties. Then I noticed something strange. There were hundreds of photos featuring Noah. Vacations. School events. Family outings. Christmas mornings. Birthday celebrations. Page after page after page. Then I started looking for myself. The further I searched, the fewer photos I found. Eventually, entire years were missing. Years. An entire period of my childhood had practically disappeared from the family record. I felt sick. Then my cousin accidentally made things worse. "Wow," she said while turning pages. "It's almost like Ethan wasn't even there." The room fell silent. Immediately, everyone realized what she'd said. Nobody knew how to respond. Nobody except Grandpa. He quietly closed the album. Then looked directly at me. "You were there." His voice was calm but firm. "And you mattered." Nobody said another word. But the damage was already done. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours. Thinking. Remembering. Questioning everything. Eventually, I reached a painful conclusion. If someone looked at those albums decades later, they would assume my parents had only one child. Noah. Not me. I had become a ghost in my own family history. A child erased while still alive. For several days afterward, I barely spoke. Grandpa noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. One evening, he found me sitting on the porch alone. "You okay?" I shrugged. He sat beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said, "Do you think they ever regret it?" He knew exactly who I meant. "I don't know." I looked down. "I keep wondering if they'll wake up someday and realize what they've done." Grandpa sighed heavily. Then he said something I would never forget. "Maybe they will." I looked at him. "Maybe they won't." He paused. "But you can't build your future around somebody else's regrets." The words hit me hard. Because deep down, I knew he was right. For years, I had been waiting. Waiting for apologies. Waiting for recognition. Waiting for love. Waiting for my parents to finally choose me. And while I waited, life kept moving forward. Maybe it was time for me to move forward too. Maybe it was time to stop chasing people who had already walked away. That night marked the end of something. The end of hope. The end of expectations. The end of waiting. For the first time in years, I accepted the truth. My parents weren't coming back. Not emotionally. Not as parents. Not as the people I needed them to be. And once I accepted that truth, something unexpected happened. I became free. I stopped looking behind me. And started looking ahead. Because while my parents were busy investing everything in Noah, I was about to start building a future nobody saw coming. A future that would one day make them remember the son they forgot. The promise I made to myself. The summer after my 16th birthday was the hottest I could remember. The fields around Grandpa's farm stretched endlessly beneath a blazing sun, and every day seemed to bring another repair, another chore, another responsibility. Most teenagers spent their summers hanging out with friends. I spent mine fixing fences, feeding livestock, and helping Grandpa keep the farm running. And honestly, I didn't mind. Because the farm had become more than just a place to live. It had become home. The kind of home I had spent years wishing for. Not because it was perfect. But because I felt wanted there. As my junior year of high school approached, one thing became increasingly clear. If I wanted a future beyond the farm, I would have to create it myself. There would be no financial help from my parents. No college fund. No safety net. No one waiting to solve my problems. At first, that realization scared me. Most kids my age had families helping them plan for the future. I had Grandpa. And while he was worth more than 100 parents, he wasn't wealthy. The farm paid the bills, but not much more. One evening after dinner, I sat with him on the porch. The sun was setting beyond the fields, painting the sky orange and gold. For a while, we watched in silence. Then Grandpa spoke. "What are your plans after high school?" I shrugged. "College, maybe." "Maybe?" I sighed. "It's expensive." Grandpa nodded slowly. "That's true." Neither of us said anything for a minute. Then he looked at me. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you're capable of a lot more than you realize." I laughed softly. "You always say that." "Because it's true." He pointed toward the horizon. "The biggest mistake people make is letting someone else decide what they're worth." I immediately knew who he was talking about. My parents. Even after all those years, the wounds they left behind still existed. They just weren't as visible anymore. Grandpa continued. "You spent years wondering why they didn't choose you." I looked down. He wasn't wrong. Even though I'd stopped hoping for their approval, part of me still carried the question. Why wasn't I enough? Why was Noah worth everything while I was worth nothing? Grandpa placed a hand on my shoulder. "One day you're going to realize something." "What?" "The way they treated you says more about them than it ever did about you." For some reason, hearing those words felt different now. Maybe because I was older. Maybe because I was finally ready to believe them. That night, I made myself a promise. A simple promise. I would build a life so good that I would never need anyone's approval again. Not my mother's. Not my father's. Not anyone's. The following year became the busiest of my life. I threw myself into school. Every assignment. Every test. Every opportunity. While other students counted down the days until graduation, I treated every day like it mattered. Because it did. I knew that if I wanted scholarships, I couldn't afford mediocrity. Failure wasn't an option. Neither was giving up. By the time senior year arrived, I ranked near the top of my class. Teachers encouraged me to apply to universities I never thought I could afford. One counselor even called me into her office. "Ethan, have you considered applying to State University?" I almost laughed. "People like me don't go there." She frowned. "What does that mean?" I hesitated. Then admitted the truth. "I can't afford it." The counselor smiled. "That's what scholarships are for." Over the next few months, I filled out applications every chance I got. Scholarships. Financial aid. Academic programs. Anything that might help. The process was exhausting. But eventually, the hard work paid off. One cold February afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. I immediately recognized the university logo. My hands shook as I opened it. The first sentence nearly made me drop the letter. Congratulations. I had been accepted. Not only accepted. Awarded a substantial academic scholarship. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. Unable to breathe. Unable to think. Unable to believe it. Then I ran outside. Grandpa was repairing a tractor near the barn. "Grandpa." He looked up. "What happened?" I handed him the letter. He adjusted his glasses and started reading. Halfway through, he stopped. Then read it again. And again. Finally, he looked at me. His eyes were shining. "You did it." I nodded. For the first time in years, tears filled my eyes. Not tears of sadness. Not tears of rejection. Tears of pride. Because for once, something good was happening. And I had earned it. That night, Grandpa insisted we celebrate. We drove to the same diner where we'd celebrated my report card years earlier. As we sat eating burgers and fries, he raised his glass. To your future. I raised mine. To our future. Graduation arrived a few months later. The football field was packed with families. Parents filled the bleachers. Cameras flashed constantly. Students laughed and posed for pictures. As I stood waiting for the ceremony to begin, I found myself looking into the crowd. Old habits die hard. For a brief moment, I wondered if my parents might show up. Maybe they'd changed. Maybe. No. I stopped myself. The ceremony began. Names were called. Diplomas were handed out. Cheers echoed through the stadium. When my name was announced, I walked across the stage. The applause was loud. But one voice stood above the rest. Grandpa's. I spotted him standing near the front. Clapping harder than anyone. Smiling wider than anyone. And suddenly I realized something. I didn't need my parents there. Because the person who mattered most had shown up. Just like he always did. After graduation, college began. And reality hit hard. Classes. Bills. Work. Responsibilities. Scholarships covered tuition, but they didn't cover everything. So I got a job. Then another. Some weeks I worked 60 hours while attending classes full-time. I barely slept. I rarely relaxed. But I kept going. Every difficult day reminded me of the promise I'd made on that porch. The promise to build my own future. The promise to never depend on people who abandoned me. By my second year, I started noticing opportunities everywhere. Businesses with problems. Services people needed. Markets nobody seemed interested in. One afternoon, while helping a local contractor with a side job, an idea formed in my mind. A simple idea. But sometimes simple ideas change everything. Over the next several months, I researched relentlessly. Asked questions. Made plans. Saved money. Then, shortly after my 22nd birthday, I took a risk. A terrifying risk. I used nearly every dollar I'd saved to start a small construction and property repair business. At first, it was just me. One truck. A handful of tools. And a dream. Most people thought I was crazy. Some said I'd fail. Others said I should focus on finding a real job. But every time doubt appeared, I remembered Grandpa's words. I had no idea that this tiny business, started with borrowed equipment, sleepless nights, and stubborn determination, would eventually become the foundation of everything. The success. The house. The wealth. The life my parents would one day desperately want to be part of. But before any of that happened, life was about to test me in a way I never expected. Because while my business was finally beginning to grow, the man who had saved my life was getting older. And time was running out. The last lesson Grandpa ever taught me. Success didn't happen overnight. Despite what people like to believe, there was no magical moment where my life suddenly changed. No investor appeared with a check. No wealthy relative left me a fortune. No miracle arrived to rescue me. There was only work. For the first 2 years, my business barely survived. I spent my days meeting clients, managing projects, and doing physical labor. At night, I handled paperwork, invoices, and scheduling. Some weeks I worked nearly 80 hours. Other weeks I wondered whether I'd made a terrible mistake. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered where I'd started. I remembered being 11 years old, standing in my parents' driveway as they drove away without looking back. I remembered all the birthdays they missed. The graduations. The phone calls that never came. And somehow those memories became fuel. Not anger. Determination. I wanted to prove to myself that my future wasn't defined by the people who abandoned me. By the time I turned 25, things finally started improving. One client recommended me to another. Then another. Soon my small company began growing faster than I expected. I hired my first employee. Then my second. Within a few years, we were handling projects throughout the county. For the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about money. Not constantly, anyway. I bought a reliable truck. Moved into a decent house. Started putting money into savings. And through it all, Grandpa remained my biggest supporter. Every Sunday afternoon, I'd drive out to the farm. No matter how busy life became. No matter how much work I had. Sunday afternoons belonged to Grandpa. We'd sit on the porch drinking iced tea. Talking about absolutely nothing. Those afternoons became my favorite part of every week. Looking back now, I think part of me sensed they wouldn't last forever. The first sign that something was wrong appeared shortly after Grandpa's 78th birthday. I arrived one Sunday and found him sitting on the porch. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But as I got closer, I noticed something. He looked tired. Not normal tired. Different. Older. For the first time in my life, he looked fragile. The realization scared me. Grandpa had always seemed indestructible. Like the farm itself. Permanent. Unchanging. A fixture in the world. But suddenly I saw the truth. Time was catching up with him. Just like everyone else. "You okay?" I asked. He smiled. "Getting old." I laughed. "You've been saying that for 10 years. Maybe this time I mean it." The joke landed differently than usual. Because neither of us truly found it funny. Over the following months, little changes appeared. He moved slower. Tired more easily. Forgot small things. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming. Just enough to make me worry. One evening I finally confronted him. "You need to see a doctor." He rolled his eyes. I knew this conversation was coming. "I'm serious." "So am I." We stared at each other. Then he sighed. "Fine." The diagnosis came 3 weeks later. Heart disease. Not immediately life-threatening. But serious. Very serious. The doctor explained treatment options. Medications. Lifestyle changes. Regular monitoring. The entire time, Grandpa remained calm. I was the one struggling. Because for the first time, I had to imagine a future without him. And I hated it. Over the next year, I started spending even more time at the farm. Some weekends I stayed overnight. Sometimes longer. The business was stable enough that I could delegate more responsibility. So I did. Because there were things more important than money. One particular evening stands out in my memory. The sun was setting. The fields glowed gold beneath the fading light. And Grandpa and I sat on the porch as we had hundreds of times before. Neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. Eventually he broke the silence. "You know what I'm most proud of?" I smiled. "Me?" He laughed. "Don't let it go to your head." I grinned. Then his expression softened. "You built a life." I looked away. He continued. "You had every excuse to fail." The words hit harder than I expected. "You were abandoned." I swallowed hard. "You were hurt." He paused. "And you still became a good man." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Because hearing those words from him meant everything. More than any business award. More than money. More than success. Finally I managed to ask, "How do you know I'm a good man?" Grandpa smiled. "Because bitter people don't spend every weekend taking care of an old farmer." I laughed despite the lump in my throat. Then his expression became serious again. "Ethan." "Yeah." "Promise me something." "Anything." He looked out across the fields. "When life gives you the chance to become the person who hurt you." He paused. "Don't take it." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means don't let pain turn you into them." The porch fell silent. I thought about my parents. About everything they'd done. About everything they'd failed to do. Then I nodded. "I promise." At the time, I didn't realize how important that promise would become. A few months later, everything changed. I was at work when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the farm's number. Immediately, my stomach tightened. Grandpa never called during the day unless something was wrong. I answered on the first ring. "Grandpa?" But it wasn't him. It was his neighbor. And the moment I heard her voice, I knew. The drive to the hospital was the longest drive of my life. Every red light felt personal. Every mile felt endless. Every second felt stolen. When I finally arrived, a doctor met me in the hallway. One look at his face told me everything. Still, I asked. "Where is he?" The doctor's expression softened. "I'm sorry." Those two words shattered something inside me. The next several hours passed in a blur. Paperwork. Phone calls. Arrangements. Conversations I barely remember. Nothing felt real. Nothing made sense. The strongest person I'd ever known was gone. The man who had raised me. Protected me. Believed in me. Gone. And suddenly the world felt smaller. Emptier. Colder. The funeral took place 4 days later. Hundreds of people attended. Farmers. Neighbors. Friends. Former co-workers. People whose lives Grandpa had quietly improved over decades. The church overflowed with mourners. Which didn't surprise me. Because Grandpa was the kind of man people never forgot. What did surprise me was seeing my parents there. For the first time in years. My mother cried loudly. My father looked solemn. Noah stood beside them. Watching everything. I hadn't seen them together in almost a decade. And seeing them again felt strange. Like meeting strangers who happened to share my last name. After the service, dozens of people approached me. Sharing stories. Memories. Kind words. Then eventually, my parents approached too. For a moment, nobody spoke. Finally my mother stepped forward. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Your loss. Not our loss. Not his father. Not the man who raised you. Just your loss." The distance between us felt enormous. "Thank you," I replied. An awkward silence followed. Then my father asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Have they read the will yet?" I blinked. "What?" "The estate." His eyes shifted toward the farm. "The property." And suddenly something inside me went cold. The funeral wasn't even over. And he was already thinking about inheritance. Money. Assets. Land. Not grandpa. Not grief. Not family. The farm. For the first time that day, I felt angry. Not sad. Angry. Because in that moment, I realized something. My parents hadn't changed. Not really. And before long, they were about to prove it. Because Grandpa had left behind more than memories. More than lessons. More than love. He had left behind a legacy. And when my parents discovered who inherited it, everything would change. The reading of the will. 3 days after Grandpa's funeral, I found myself sitting inside a lawyer's office. It was one of those old-fashioned offices with dark wooden furniture, shelves packed with legal books, and framed certificates hanging on every wall. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Normally, it would have felt comforting. That day, it felt suffocating. Because sitting across from me were the people I hadn't truly considered family for years. My parents. And Noah. The four of us hadn't been in the same room together for more than a decade. Even now, nobody seemed comfortable. Nobody seemed sure what to say. Not that there was much to say. Years of neglect couldn't be erased with small talk. The lawyer entered carrying a thick folder. After offering polite condolences, he sat down and opened the file. The room immediately fell silent. I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about property. Honestly, I didn't care. I would have traded every dollar Grandpa owned for one more conversation with him. One more Sunday afternoon on the porch. One more terrible joke. One more piece of advice. But life doesn't work that way. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Then began reading. For several minutes, everything was routine. Small donations to charities. Gifts to old friends. Specific items left to neighbors and relatives. Exactly the sort of things I expected. Then the lawyer reached the final section. The section that mattered. The remainder of the estate, including the farm, residence, savings, investments, and all associated assets. He paused. Then continued. Is left entirely to my grandson, Ethan Carter. The room went completely silent. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy. The kind that changes everything. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. Noah's eyes widened. My father's jaw tightened. The lawyer continued speaking, explaining details I barely heard. My mind was somewhere else. Back on the farm. Back on the porch. Back with Grandpa. This wasn't about money. This was Grandpa's final message. His final act of love. His way of ensuring that the boy nobody wanted would always have a home. That realization nearly broke me. I lowered my head and swallowed hard. Trying to maintain control. trying not to cry in front of everyone. Across the table, however, my parents seemed focused on something entirely different. Shock. Disbelief. And something else. Something ugly. Disappointment. The meeting ended shortly afterward. The lawyer handed me paperwork and explained the next steps. Then everyone stood. As I gathered my documents, my father finally spoke. I didn't realize Dad had accumulated that much. I looked up. There it was. Not grief. Not reflection. Money. Again. The same thing he'd been focused on at the funeral. The same thing he seemed focused on now. I simply nodded. Noah crossed his arms. Must be nice. His tone surprised me. There was bitterness in it. Bitterness directed at me. As though I'd somehow done something wrong. As though Grandpa's decision was my fault. I almost laughed. Instead, I remained quiet. Because arguing wouldn't change anything. The lawyer's office slowly emptied. I was halfway to my truck when I heard footsteps behind me. Ethan. I turned around. My mother. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. A strange smile. One I hadn't seen directed at me in years. You know. She hesitated. Your grandfather was always proud of you. The words should have meant something. Instead, they felt hollow. Because they were arriving decades too late. Yeah, I said quietly. He was. She looked uncomfortable. Almost nervous. Then she surprised me. We should have dinner sometime. I blinked. Dinner? Just family. Family. The word felt strange coming from her. For years, I hadn't been part of that category. Now suddenly I was. I wondered why. Then I remembered the will. The answer became obvious. That evening, as I drove home, my phone rang. Mom. I ignored it. 5 minutes later, she called again. Then Dad. Then another message. Then another. By the time I reached my driveway, there were 7 missed calls. 7. More communication in one afternoon than I'd received from them in some years. The timing wasn't exactly subtle. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Calls. Texts. Invitations. Sudden interest. At first, I tried convincing myself it wasn't connected to the inheritance. Maybe Grandpa's death had made them reflect. Maybe they regretted the past. Maybe. No. I knew better. And eventually, they proved it. About a month later, I reluctantly agreed to have dinner with them. Partly out of curiosity. Partly because I wanted answers. We met at a restaurant halfway between the farm and their town. The moment I arrived, I noticed something. Everyone seemed unusually friendly. My mother smiled constantly. My father asked questions about my business. Even Noah acted polite. It felt unnatural. Like actors performing a role. The conversation remained pleasant until dessert arrived. Then the mask started slipping. Dad stirred his coffee. So how's business these days? Good. Very good. I shrugged. Good enough. He nodded thoughtfully. Then came the next question. What are your plans for the farm? There it was. The real reason for dinner. I took a sip of water. I'll keep it. My mother looked relieved. That's wonderful. I said nothing. She continued. Your grandfather would have wanted that. Again, I stayed silent. Because I was beginning to notice a pattern. Every conversation eventually returned to one topic. The farm. The inheritance. The money. Never our relationship. Never the past. Never what happened when I was 11. As the weeks passed, things became increasingly obvious. The more they learned about my financial situation, the more interested they became. When they discovered my company had expanded into multiple counties, their calls increased. When they learned I owned several rental properties, they became even friendlier. And when they found out I had paid off the mortgage on my house, everything changed. One Saturday afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from my aunt. She sounded hesitant. Nathan and Claire are struggling. I frowned. Nathan and Claire. My parents. What do you mean? She sighed. Then slowly explained. Over the years, they had spent enormous amounts of money on Noah. Private schools. Luxury cars. College tuition. Credit card debt. Failed business ventures. Repeated bailouts. Every time Noah made a mistake, they fixed it. Every time he failed, they rescued him. And now, the bill had finally come due. Retirement funds depleted. Debt growing. Financial pressure mounting. I listened quietly. Not because I enjoyed hearing it, but because it explained everything. The phone calls. The invitations. The sudden affection. The interest in my life. For the first time, the entire picture became clear. They didn't miss me. They needed me. And those are two very different things. That realization hurt more than I expected. Not because I was surprised. Because I wasn't. Deep down, I'd known all along. But hearing confirmation still stung. Later that night, I sat alone on Grandpa's porch. The same porch where he'd given me countless lessons over the years. The same porch where he'd told me not to let pain turn me into the people who hurt me. I stared out across the fields. Thinking. Remembering. Trying to decide what kind of man I wanted to be. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Mom. Your father and I were wondering if we could come visit next weekend. We'd love to spend some time together. I read the message twice. Then a third time. Something about it felt different. Not the words. The timing. The urgency. The sudden enthusiasm. And for reasons I couldn't explain, a feeling settled in my stomach. A warning. A sense that something bigger was coming. Something they hadn't asked for yet. But planned to. I didn't know it then. But within a few weeks, my parents would walk into my house and make a demand so unbelievable that even I would struggle to believe it. A demand that would force me to confront everything they had done. Everything they had taken. And everything they thought they were still entitled to.